The champagne glass trembled in my hand as Richard Harrison's booming voice echoed across the packed ballroom of the Bellagio Las Vegas. 200 of the construction industry's most powerful players had gathered for the annual Commercial Development Summit, and my father-in-law stood at the podium like a king addressing his subjects. "Some people think they can waltz into our industry with fancy degrees and pretty sketches," Richard declared, his steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd before landing directly on me. "But real construction isn't about playing with colors and furniture arrangements. It's about steel, concrete, and the backbone to build something that lasts." The pointed insult hit its mark. Every person in that ballroom knew he was talking about me. Emma Collins, the interior designer who had somehow married into the Harrison construction dynasty. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck as conversations around me hushed to uncomfortable whispers. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in less than 10 minutes, I would stand up and deliver the most satisfying revelation of my life. Because the man who had spent 3 years calling my work decorative nonsense had no idea that I was the silent partner behind Meridian Development, the company that had just secured the 3 largest commercial contracts in Atlanta, effectively crushing Harrison Construction's expansion plans. Sometimes the best revenge is served with a side of public humiliation and a glass of very expensive champagne. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor of my downtown Atlanta loft, surrounded by fabric samples, paint swatches, and the crushing weight of another rejected proposal. Blueprint Interiors, the commercial design firm I'd built from nothing, was hemorrhaging money faster than I could say creative vision. The industrial space I'd converted into my office and showroom felt cavernous and cold, much like my marriage had become. My laptop screen displayed the latest email rejection, this one from Cornerstone Properties. "While we appreciate your innovative approach, we've decided to go with a more established firm for our Buckhead project." More established. Code for bigger, older, and connected to the right last names in Atlanta's tight-knit development community. The heavy metal door of my loft creaked open, and my business partner, Lisa Martinez, walked in carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from the cafe downstairs. Lisa had been my anchor since we'd graduated from Georgia Tech's architecture program 5 years ago. While I'd branched into interior design, she'd stayed focused on structural engineering, but her analytical mind had become invaluable in running the business side of Blueprint Interiors. "Another rejection?" she asked, settling beside me on the makeshift seating area we'd created from reclaimed warehouse pallets and industrial cushions. I nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. Cornerstone. That's the 4th major project this month that went to firms half as creative but twice as connected. Lisa pulled out her tablet and scrolled through our project pipeline. "Emma, we need to talk numbers. If we don't land something significant in the next 60 days, we're going to have to consider scaling back. Maybe subletting part of the space." The thought of downsizing felt like admitting defeat. I'd poured everything into Blueprint Interiors, not just my savings but my identity. Growing up in a working-class family in Marietta, I'd watched my parents struggle to make ends meet while dreaming of something bigger. My father worked construction, ironically enough, though never for companies as large as Harrison Construction. My mother cleaned office buildings downtown, including some that I now bid on for design contracts. "What about the Harrison project?" Lisa asked carefully. We both knew this was a sensitive subject. I laughed, bitterly. "You mean the project my father-in-law specifically requested I not bid on because it would create a conflict of interest?" 3 weeks ago, Harrison Construction had announced they'd won the contract to build Peachtree Commons, a massive mixed-use development that would reshape downtown Atlanta's skyline. The project included luxury condominiums, premium office space, and high-end retail, exactly the type of comprehensive commercial design work that could establish Blueprint Interiors as a major player. When I'd mentioned submitting a proposal to Jake over dinner, he'd gone silent for a long moment before saying his father thought it would be inappropriate for family members to compete for company contracts. Richard's actual words, according to Jake, had been far less diplomatic. "Tell your wife to stick to decorating living rooms. Real commercial work requires experience she doesn't have." You know what really bothers me? I said, standing up to pace around the open space. It's not just that he doesn't respect my work, it's that Jake doesn't defend it anymore. Lisa had witnessed the slow erosion of my marriage over the past year. Jake Harrison had been different when we'd met during my final semester at Georgia Tech. He'd been working toward his MBA at Emory, full of ideas about modernizing his family's construction business and bringing innovative approaches to traditional building methods. He'd seemed fascinated by my passion for creating spaces that weren't just functional but emotionally resonant. That Jake felt like a stranger now. Somewhere between our wedding 3 years ago and today, he'd transformed into a carbon copy of his father, complete with the same dismissive attitude toward anything that didn't involve heavy machinery and profit margins. "When's the last time you two talked about your actual dreams?" Lisa asked gently. Not the business, not his father's expectations, but what you both wanted when you got married. I couldn't remember. Our conversations had become a series of logistics about family dinners, updates on Harrison construction projects, and Jake's increasingly frequent complaints about the pressure his father put on him to prove himself worthy of eventually inheriting the company. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Dad wants us at the house for dinner tonight, 7 sharp. Wear something nice, the Caldwells will be there." The Caldwells owned the largest architectural firm in Atlanta, and dinner with them always meant business. It also meant I'd spend the evening listening to Richard pontificate about the construction industry, while occasionally throwing barbed comments my way about artistic types who didn't understand the practical realities of building. "I should probably head home and change," I told Lisa, gathering up the fabric samples scattered around me. Another command performance at the Harrison estate. Lisa watched me with concern. "Emma, you know you don't have to keep subjecting yourself to this, right? You're brilliant at what you do, and eventually the right people will recognize that." I appreciated her loyalty, but sitting in my struggling design studio, surrounded by rejected proposals and mounting bills, it was hard to believe that eventually would come soon enough to save my business or my sanity. The drive from downtown Atlanta to the Harrison family estate in Buckhead normally took 30 minutes, but evening traffic stretched it to nearly an hour. I used the time to mentally prepare for another evening of subtle insults and not-so-subtle reminders of my place in the Harrison hierarchy. Jake was already home when I arrived at our midtown apartment, a space that had once felt like a perfect compromise between his desire for upscale living and my need for creative inspiration. Now it just felt like a way station between my real life downtown and the performance I put on for his family. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie as I walked into our bedroom to change. The question was automatic, the kind of thing married people asked each other without really listening to the answer. "Another rejection," I said, pulling a navy dress from my closet. "Cornerstone Properties." Jake nodded absently while checking his phone. "Dad mentioned that project. He said they were looking for something more traditional anyway. Probably wouldn't have been a good fit for your style." The casual dismissal stung more than his father's direct insults. At least Richard's antagonism was honest. Jake's indifference was worse because it came wrapped in the language of care. "My style," I repeated. "You mean the style you used to say would revolutionize commercial design in Atlanta?" He looked up from his phone with a slight frown. "I still think you're talented, Emma, but Dad has a point about market realities. Most commercial clients want proven approaches, not experimental concepts." "When did you start calling them experimental concepts?" I asked, stepping into my dress. "You used to call them innovative solutions." Jake's expression shifted, the look he got when he felt caught between his loyalty to me and his need to align with his father. "I'm just trying to be realistic about the business climate. Dad's been in this industry for 30 years. Maybe we should trust his perspective." As if my career had become a joint decision rather than my individual passion and expertise. The Harrison estate sat on 5 acres in the heart of Buckhead. Its sprawling Georgian colonial design perfectly embodying old Atlanta money and conservative taste. Richard had purchased the property 20 years ago, when Harrison Construction was expanding beyond residential work into major commercial projects. Every detail of the house, from the perfectly manicured gardens to the imposing front columns, was designed to convey success and establish hierarchy. Jake parked his BMW beside his sister Sarah's Mercedes in the circular driveway. Sarah worked as Harrison Construction's project manager, and had inherited her father's talent for making people feel small while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Remember," Jake said as we walked toward the front door, "the Caldwells are potential partners on the West Side development. Dad wants everything to go smoothly tonight." I nodded, slipping into the role I'd perfected over 3 years of family dinners. Smile pleasantly, ask appropriate questions about business without offering opinions, and avoid any mention of my own work unless directly asked, which rarely happened. Richard answered the door himself, his imposing 6'3" frame filling the doorway. At 58, he remained powerfully built from his years of hands-on construction work before transitioning to the executive side of the business. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his handshake was designed to remind people of his physical strength, even as he'd moved into boardrooms. "Jake, good to see you, Emma." He nodded in my direction with the bare minimum of acknowledgement. "The Caldwells are already here. David's been looking forward to discussing the West Side project." We followed him through the marble-floored foyer into the formal living room, where Sarah was entertaining David and Margaret Caldwell with stories about Harrison Construction's latest projects. Sarah had inherited Richard's commanding presence and sharp business mind, but unlike her father, she wielded her intelligence with surgical precision rather than blunt force. "Emma!" Margaret Caldwell rose to greet me with the kind of enthusiastic warmth that suggested she either genuinely liked me or was exceptionally skilled at social performance. "How lovely to see you again. How's your design business coming along?" Before I could answer, Richard jumped in. "Emma's been keeping busy with residential projects, small-scale stuff, but she seems to enjoy it." The casual revision of my work from commercial to residential wasn't accidental. Richard had a talent for diminishing people's accomplishments while maintaining plausible deniability. I'd learned not to correct these mischaracterizations because doing so would be perceived as argumentative or defensive. "Actually," I said carefully, "Blueprint Interiors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Focuses primarily on commercial work. We specialize in creating functional yet inspiring environments for businesses. David Caldwell, a distinguished man in his early 60s who had built Caldwell Architecture into one of the Southeast's most respected firms, looked interested. Commercial work is challenging. There's real skill required to balance aesthetic vision with practical functionality and budget constraints. "Exactly," I agreed, grateful for someone who understood the complexity of what I did. Every project requires solving unique puzzles about how people interact with spaces, and how design can improve both productivity and well-being. Richard's expression tightened slightly. "Of course, there's a significant difference between decorating existing spaces and actually building them from the ground up. Real commercial development requires understanding structural engineering, building codes, contractor management, and budget realities that most designers never encounter." The implication was clear. I was playing in the shallow end while the men handled the serious work of actual construction. David Caldwell, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with the dismissive tone. "Good design and good construction should be partners, not competitors," David said diplomatically. "The best projects happen when architects, designers, and builders collaborate from the beginning." "Absolutely," Sarah chimed in, her smile bright and seemingly supportive. "Though it can be tricky when family members work in related fields. Creates potential conflicts of interest, doesn't it, Dad?" The comment was aimed directly at me, a reminder of the conversation about the Peachtree Commons project. Richard nodded approvingly at his daughter's political instincts. "Family and business should remain separate," Richard agreed. "Too many complications arise when people try to mix personal relationships with professional decisions. Better to keep clear boundaries." Jake shifted uncomfortably beside me but said nothing. His silence felt like another small betrayal, another moment when he chose his father's approval over defending his wife. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, where Richard's wife Patricia had created a perfect setting with crystal glasses, fine china, and fresh flowers, arranged with the kind of precision that money could buy. Patricia Harrison was a master of social orchestration, capable of managing complex family dynamics while maintaining an atmosphere of gracious hospitality. The conversation flowed smoothly through safe topics: the local real estate market, upcoming charity events, and vacation plans. I participated when appropriate, asked thoughtful questions, and avoided anything that might be construed as controversial or challenging. It wasn't until dessert that Richard turned the conversation toward business specifics. "David, I've been thinking about your proposal for partnering on the West Side development," Richard said, cutting into his slice of pecan pie. "Harrison Construction could handle all the building and site preparation, while Caldwell Architecture manages the design and planning phases." David nodded thoughtfully. "It's an intriguing opportunity. The scope is large enough that collaboration makes sense, and our firms have complementary strengths. The key," Richard continued, "is making sure we control every aspect of the project. Too many developments fail because the client brings in too many different contractors and consultants. Mixed visions, conflicting priorities, budget overruns. Quality control is definitely important," David agreed. "Though I found that diverse perspectives can sometimes lead to more innovative solutions, as long as there's strong project management." Richard's expression suggested he disagreed with the value of diverse perspectives, but he was too politically savvy to argue with a potential partner. "Innovation is fine as long as it doesn't compromise functionality or profitability," Sarah added. "Clients might be attracted to creative concepts initially, but ultimately they want spaces that work efficiently and maintain their value over time." Creative concepts, I noticed, had become the evening's euphemism for impractical ideas. Every comment seemed designed to reinforce the notion that serious commercial development required practical, traditional approaches, rather than innovative design thinking. "Emma," Margaret Caldwell said suddenly, turning toward me with genuine curiosity, "you must have thoughts about balancing creativity with commercial viability. That's exactly the challenge facing interior designers working on large-scale projects." I felt the entire table's attention focus on me. Jake tensed slightly, and Richard's expression suggested he was prepared to intervene if I said something inappropriate. "It's definitely a balance," I agreed carefully. "But I think the best commercial spaces are the ones that solve functional problems through creative solutions, rather than treating creativity and functionality as opposing forces." "Can you give us an example?" David asked, seeming genuinely interested in my perspective. I thought about several Blueprint Interiors projects that had successfully balanced innovation with practical requirements. We recently worked on an office space for a tech startup that needed to accommodate rapid growth while maintaining their collaborative culture. Instead of traditional cubicles or private offices, we created modular workstations that could be reconfigured as teams expanded or projects required different collaboration patterns. "Interesting approach," Margaret said. "How did it work out?" The client reported a 20% increase in productivity measures and significantly improved employee satisfaction scores. The modular design also saved them money because they didn't need to renovate every time they hired new people or restructured teams. I could see David Caldwell processing the information with professional interest, while Richard's expression suggested skepticism about whether such metrics could be trusted or attributed to design choices. "That's a nice story," Richard said with a patronizing smile, "but small tech startups have very different needs than major commercial developments. When you're talking about millions of dollars in construction costs and long-term leasing commitments, proven approaches are more reliable than experimental layouts." The word experimental again. I was beginning to understand that it was Richard's favorite way to dismiss any approach that didn't align with his traditional methods. "Of course," I replied, recognizing that any further defense of creative approaches would be perceived as argumentative. "Every project has unique requirements." The conversation moved away from design philosophy toward safer topics like construction timelines and permit processes. I finished my dessert and participated minimally while internally cataloging another evening of subtle professional diminishment. Later, as Jake and I drove back to our apartment, I tried to process the evening's dynamics. "The Caldwells seem nice," I offered, testing whether Jake had noticed the undercurrents of the conversation. "Dad's excited about the partnership potential," Jake replied. "David's firm has the kind of reputation that could really elevate Harrison Construction's profile on major projects." I waited for him to acknowledge the way his father had dismissed my work or the awkwardness of the dinner conversation, but Jake seemed oblivious to anything beyond the business implications. "Did you notice how your father characterized my work tonight?" I asked finally. Jake glanced at me with a slight frown. "What do you mean?" He kept calling it residential work and experimental concepts. He made it sound like I decorate living rooms instead of designing commercial spaces. "I think you might be reading too much into it," Jake said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a conversation he wanted to have. "Dad's just focused on making a good impression with potential partners. It wasn't personal." The casual dismissal of my experience felt like a physical blow. Jake hadn't just failed to notice his father's behavior, he was actively minimizing my concerns about it. "It felt personal to me," I said quietly. "Emma, you know Dad respects your work. He just thinks family and business should stay separate, which makes sense from a practical standpoint." I stared out the window at the Atlanta skyline, its lights reflecting my growing sense of isolation. My husband had become so aligned with his father's perspective that he could no longer see situations from my point of view, even when they directly affected me. The next morning, I arrived at my loft studio earlier than usual, hoping that immersing myself in work would help process the frustration from the previous evening. Lisa was already there, reviewing proposals at our makeshift conference table constructed from reclaimed wood and industrial pipe legs. "How was dinner with the royal family?" she asked without looking up from her laptop. "Educational," I replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm learning that my work is apparently experimental and residential, despite all evidence to the contrary." Lisa finally looked up, her expression sympathetic. "Let me guess. Richard Harrison provided another masterclass in subtle condescension?" With Jake nodding along like a devoted apprentice, I added, "I think I'm losing my husband to his father's gravitational pull." "Emma," Lisa said, her tone becoming serious, "I need to show you something that might be relevant to last night's conversation." She turned her laptop screen toward me, displaying a news article from the Atlanta Business Chronicle. The headline read, "Major Development Projects Reshape Atlanta's Commercial Landscape." "Look at the companies mentioned in this article," Lisa said, pointing to specific paragraphs. "Harrison Construction is featured prominently, but notice the other names." I scanned the article, which discussed several large-scale development projects transforming various Atlanta neighborhoods. Harrison Construction was indeed mentioned as a major player, but the article also highlighted Meridian Development, a company I'd never heard of that had apparently secured several significant contracts recently. "Who's Meridian Development?" I asked. "That's what's interesting," Lisa replied. "They appeared on the Atlanta development scene about 18 months ago, and they've been winning major projects consistently. But nobody seems to know much about their ownership structure or funding sources." "Why is this relevant to last night?" Lisa pulled up another browser window showing Meridian Development's website. The company's portfolio included several high-profile projects, and their approach emphasized innovative design integration with sustainable building practices. "Look at their project descriptions," Lisa said. "This is exactly the kind of creative problem-solving you were talking about at dinner. They're successfully implementing the innovative approaches that Richard Harrison dismisses as experimental." I studied the website more carefully. Meridian's projects did indeed reflect sophisticated integration of creative design with commercial functionality. Their Buckhead office complex featured adaptable workspaces, their Midtown retail development incorporated community gathering areas, and their proposed West Side project emphasized environmental sustainability alongside aesthetic appeal. "This is exactly what I wish Blueprint Interiors could be working on," I said, feeling a mixture of inspiration and frustration. "Here's the thing," Lisa continued. "Meridian has been consistently beating established firms like Harrison Construction on major contracts. Richard Harrison's dismissal of innovative approaches might be more about competitive pressure than philosophical conviction. The possibility that Richard's antagonism toward creative design wasn't just personal prejudice, but strategic positioning, added a new dimension to last night's conversation. If innovative approaches were actually threatening traditional construction companies' market dominance, then his dismissal of my work might be more calculated than I'd realized. "I wonder if there's a way to connect with Meridian," I mused. "Their projects are exactly the kind of work Blueprint Interiors should be doing." Lisa grinned. "Funny you should mention that. I've been researching their recent projects, and several of them specifically mention needing interior design partnerships." They seemed to be building a network of creative collaborators rather than relying on traditional contractor relationships. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of genuine excitement about my professional prospects. Maybe there were companies in Atlanta that valued innovative design approaches. Maybe Richard Harrison's perspective wasn't the only one that mattered in the commercial development world. I spent the rest of the morning researching Meridian Development more thoroughly, trying to understand their business model and project philosophy. Their website emphasized collaborative approaches, sustainable practices, and design solutions that prioritized both functionality and human experience. Everything about their work reflected values that aligned perfectly with my vision for Blueprint Interiors, and their rapid success suggested that Atlanta's commercial development market was more open to innovation than Richard Harrison wanted to believe. By lunchtime, I had drafted a professional inquiry to Meridian Development, expressing Blueprint Interiors' interest in potential collaboration opportunities. I crafted the message carefully, highlighting our experience with functional design solutions and our commitment to creating spaces that enhanced both productivity and well-being. "You're really going to reach out to them?" Lisa asked, reading over my shoulder as I finalized the email. "What's the worst that could happen?" I replied. "They ignore me, just like every other major development company in Atlanta?" "Or," Lisa suggested with a smile, "they recognize your talent and offer you the kind of projects that could establish Blueprint Interiors as a major player in commercial design." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the response. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was taking proactive steps toward the career I wanted, rather than simply enduring the career limitations that others had imposed on me. That afternoon, as I worked on smaller residential projects that were keeping Blueprint Interiors afloat, I found myself imagining what it would be like to collaborate with a company that shared my values and respected my expertise. The fantasy felt both thrilling and dangerous, like I was planning an escape from a situation I hadn't fully acknowledged I wanted to leave. When I arrived home that evening, Jake was already there, working on his laptop at our kitchen table. The domestic scene felt normal on the surface, but I was becoming increasingly aware of the emotional distance between us. "How was your day?" he asked, the same automatic question as always. "I reached out to a potential new client," I replied, testing whether he'd show interest in my business developments. "That's good," he said without looking up from his screen. "We should probably talk about this weekend, by the way. Dad wants us to come to Sarah's birthday dinner Saturday night." Another family gathering, another opportunity to be reminded of my place in the Harrison hierarchy. But this time, the prospect didn't feel quite as suffocating as usual. I had sent out a message to Meridian Development, a small act of professional independence that felt like the beginning of something larger. "Sure," I agreed. "Saturday works." As Jake returned to his laptop and I began preparing dinner, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my thinking. For the first time since marrying into the Harrison family, I was actively pursuing opportunities that existed entirely outside their sphere of influence. I didn't know yet what would come of my outreach to Meridian Development, but I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my professional autonomy. Whatever happened next, I was no longer content to accept Richard Harrison's limitations on my career or his dismissive characterization of my work. The game was about to change, and for once, I felt like I might be the one controlling the moves. 3 days after sending my inquiry to Meridian Development, I was knee-deep in fabric samples for a small restaurant renovation when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made me answer immediately. "Emma Collins? This is Michael Chen from Meridian Development. I received your email about potential collaboration opportunities." My heart jumped. Michael Chen's voice was warm but professional, with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to making important decisions. I had researched Meridian's leadership team extensively but found surprisingly little information about their executive structure online. "Mr. Chen, thank you so much for calling. I wasn't sure if my inquiry would reach the right person. Please call me Michael, and your email definitely caught my attention. Blueprint Interiors has an impressive portfolio, especially your work on the Brookhaven office complex. The modular design concept was exactly the kind of innovative thinking we value at Meridian." I was stunned that he had taken the time to research my work before calling. Most potential clients barely glanced at portfolios before scheduling meetings, if they bothered to meet at all. I appreciate you looking at our projects. Your company's approach to commercial development really resonates with what we're trying to achieve in interior design. That's what I was hoping to hear, Michael replied. Would you be available to meet for coffee this week? I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might be mutually beneficial. We arranged to meet Thursday afternoon at a small cafe in Virginia Highland, an area far enough from Buckhead in downtown to avoid accidentally encountering anyone from Jake's business or social circles. I spent the intervening days researching everything I could find about Michael Chen and Meridian Development, but information remained surprisingly sparse for such a successful company. Thursday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October in Atlanta. I chose the Virginia Highland location carefully, a neighborhood coffee shop with excellent reviews but limited visibility from the main business corridors where Harrison Construction operated. Walking into the cafe, I immediately spotted Michael Chen at a corner table, recognizable from the few professional photos I'd found online. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of understated confidence that came from genuine achievement rather than inherited status. His handshake was firm without being performative, and his smile seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally calculated. Emma, thank you for making time to meet. I have to admit, I've been looking forward to this conversation. We settled into our seats with coffee, and Michael's direct approach immediately set him apart from the elaborate social choreography that characterized most Atlanta business meetings. Let me be straightforward about why I wanted to meet with you, he began. Meridian Development is expanding rapidly, and we need interior design partners who understand that commercial spaces should enhance human experience, rather than simply fulfill basic functional requirements. That's exactly what Blueprint Interiors aims to do, I replied. Though I have to admit, it's been challenging to find clients who share that philosophy. Michael nodded knowingly. Atlanta's commercial development scene can be surprisingly conservative. Many established firms prioritize proven approaches over innovative solutions, even when innovation could provide better outcomes for their clients. The way he phrased it suggested familiarity with the local business environment's resistance to new ideas. I wondered if Meridian had faced similar challenges breaking into Atlanta's tight-knit development community. How has Meridian managed to secure major projects so quickly? I asked. From what I've researched, you've had remarkable success in a relatively short time. Michael's expression became slightly more guarded, as if he was choosing his words carefully. We've been fortunate to identify opportunities where traditional approaches weren't serving clients effectively. Sometimes disruption creates space for companies that can offer better solutions. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper knowledge of specific competitors and their weaknesses. Before I could probe further, he shifted the conversation toward Blueprint Interiors. Tell me about your vision for commercial design. What would you create if budget and client conservatism weren't limiting factors? The question unlocked something I'd been holding back during months of smaller projects and rejected proposals. I found myself describing the kind of transformative commercial spaces I'd dreamed of creating since graduate school. Offices that adapted to different work styles throughout the day. Retail environments that fostered genuine community connections. Mixed-use developments that enhanced neighborhood character rather than overwhelming it. Michael listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both business acumen and genuine appreciation for design thinking. Our conversation flowed naturally from project concepts to implementation challenges to the broader philosophy of creating built environments that served human needs. You understand something that many people in this industry miss, Michael said after I described my approach to designing flexible workspaces. Buildings aren't just structures, they're tools for enabling human potential. The best commercial developments don't just house businesses, they amplify their success. His insight impressed me. Most developers focused on square footage, lease rates, and construction costs. Michael seemed to grasp the more complex relationship between design quality and business outcomes. That's exactly what I believe, I agreed. But it's been difficult to find clients who are willing to invest in that level of design integration. What if I told you that Meridian Development is looking for an interior design partner for multiple major projects over the next 18 months? Michael asked. And what if those projects specifically required the kind of innovative thinking you've been describing? The opportunity sounded almost too good to be true. What kind of projects are we talking about? Michael pulled out his tablet and showed me a presentation outlining Meridian's development pipeline. 3 major mixed-use projects in different Atlanta neighborhoods, each requiring comprehensive interior design for office spaces, retail areas, and common areas. The scope was larger than anything Blueprint Interiors had ever been considered for. These projects would establish Blueprint Interiors as a major player in Atlanta commercial design, I said, trying to contain my excitement. But I have to ask, why us? There are much larger firms with more extensive commercial portfolios. Because larger firms tend to rely on template solutions rather than genuine innovation, Michael replied. We've seen your ability to solve complex problems creatively, and that's exactly what these projects require. I studied the project details more carefully, noting the locations and scope of work. Each development was in a neighborhood where Harrison Construction had been pursuing contracts or expressing interest in future expansion. Can I ask how familiar you are with other Atlanta development companies? I ventured. The local market is pretty interconnected, and I want to make sure there aren't any potential conflicts I should be aware of. Michael's expression became thoughtful, as if he was deciding how much to reveal. I'm quite familiar with the local market. In fact, I have considerable experience with several established firms, including Harrison Construction. The mention of Richard's company sent a jolt through me. You've worked with Harrison Construction? I worked for Harrison Construction, Michael corrected, for 7 years, until about 2 years ago. The revelation completely recontextualized everything about our conversation. Michael Chen wasn't just a successful developer who happened to compete with Richard Harrison. He was someone with inside knowledge of Harrison Construction's operations and presumably personal experience with Richard's management style. You worked directly with Richard Harrison? I asked, trying to process this unexpected connection. Richard was my supervisor for most of that time, Michael confirmed. I started as a project manager and eventually became senior development director. I was responsible for identifying new market opportunities and managing relationships with subcontractors and design partners. Questions flooded my mind. Why had Michael left Harrison Construction? What was his relationship with Richard? Did he know about my connection to the Harrison family? I should probably mention, I said carefully, that Richard Harrison is my father-in-law. I'm married to his son, Jake. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't seem shocked by the information. I wondered if there might be a family connection when I saw your last name was Collins, rather than Harrison. Richard mentioned his son's wife occasionally during company meetings. What did he say about me? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Michael hesitated diplomatically. He expressed concerns about potential conflicts of interest if family members became involved in company business. He felt it was important to maintain clear boundaries between personal relationships and professional operations. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the reality that Richard had probably dismissed me as irrelevant to serious business discussions. I appreciated Michael's tact in not repeating whatever disparaging comments Richard had actually made. That sounds like him, I acknowledged. Richard has been very clear that he doesn't think my work is appropriate for major commercial projects. Richard Harrison has strong opinions about many things, Michael said, his tone neutral but somehow conveying volumes about his own experiences. He's particularly resistant to approaches that deviate from traditional construction and development methods. I sensed there was much more to Michael's story about working for Harrison Construction, but he seemed reluctant to elaborate without prompting. Our conversation had already covered substantial ground, and I didn't want to push too hard for information he might not be ready to share. Can I ask what led you to start Meridian Development? I said, choosing a question that might reveal more about his background without being too intrusive. Michael was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. I reached a point where I realized I couldn't implement the kind of development projects I believed in while working within Harrison Construction's framework. Richard and I had fundamental disagreements about market opportunities and client service approaches. What kind of disagreements? Richard believed that established methods were always safer and more profitable. I believed that Atlanta's commercial development market was evolving, and that companies needed to adapt to new client expectations and urban planning trends. The conflict sounded familiar. Michael had apparently faced the same resistance to innovative thinking that I encountered whenever I suggested creative design solutions at Harrison family gatherings. How did Richard respond to your proposals for new approaches? Michael's smile was rueful. Not well. He made it clear that questioning established Harrison construction methods was not welcome, regardless of potential benefits to clients or competitive advantages. I could easily imagine Richard's reaction to challenges to his authority or suggestions that his methods might be outdated. His need to control conversations and decisions was evident in every family interaction I'd witnessed. That must have been frustrating, I said. It was educational, Michael replied. I learned that some environments don't allow for growth or innovation, regardless of individual talent or market opportunities. Eventually, I realized I needed to create the kind of company I wanted to work for. The parallel to my own situation was unmistakable. I was experiencing similar frustrations with feeling constrained by Richard's influence over my professional opportunities, though my challenges were filtered through family dynamics rather than direct employment. Starting Meridian must have been a significant risk, I observed. Less risky than staying in a situation that was limiting my potential, Michael said. And I had advantages that made the transition easier than it might have been otherwise. What kind of advantages? Michael paused, seeming to consider how much detail to provide. When I left Harrison Construction, I retained relationships with several suppliers and subcontractors who were interested in working with more innovative development approaches. I also had financing connections who were looking for investment opportunities in Atlanta's growing commercial market. The explanation was plausible, but vague enough to suggest there might be more to the story. Michael's rapid success with Meridian development seemed to require more than just good relationships and general financing connections. The timeline is impressive, I said. Meridian has secured major contracts very quickly for a new company. We've been fortunate to identify projects where clients were dissatisfied with traditional development approaches, Michael agreed. Atlanta's commercial market is more competitive than many established firms realize. Clients increasingly want partners who can deliver innovative solutions rather than template projects. Our conversation was interrupted by Michael's phone buzzing with what appeared to be an urgent message. He glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. I'm sorry, but I need to respond to this quickly. Would you mind if I stepped outside for a brief call? Of course, I agreed, grateful for a moment to process everything he'd shared. While Michael handled his call, I tried to organize my thoughts about this unexpected development. Meeting someone with direct experience working for Richard Harrison was surprising enough, but discovering that Michael had left the company due to philosophical disagreements added layers of complexity I hadn't anticipated. The opportunity to partner with Meridian Development on major projects was exactly what Blueprint Interiors needed to establish credibility in Atlanta's commercial design market. But the personal connections to Richard and the history of conflict between Michael and my father-in-law created potential complications I hadn't considered when reaching out to the company. Michael returned to our table with an apologetic expression. Sorry about that. Where were we? You were explaining how Meridian identified market opportunities so quickly, I said. Right. The key insight was recognizing that Atlanta's commercial development needs were evolving faster than established firms were adapting. Clients wanted more sophisticated design integration, more sustainable building practices, and more flexible space planning than traditional developers were offering. And Harrison Construction wasn't interested in adapting to those trends? Michael's expression became carefully neutral. Richard Harrison built his company's reputation on reliable execution of proven building methods. He viewed market trends as temporary fluctuations rather than fundamental shifts requiring operational changes. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't hide the suggestion that Richard had been resistant to acknowledging changing client expectations. I wondered if Michael's departure had been voluntary, or if their disagreements had led to a more dramatic separation. How does Richard feel about Meridian's success in the Atlanta market? I asked. I imagine he views us as temporary competition that will eventually be eliminated by more established firms with superior resources and experience, Michael replied. Richard doesn't typically consider smaller companies as serious long-term threats. The assessment aligned with Richard's general attitude toward businesses he didn't respect. He had expressed similar dismissive opinions about several competitors over the years, usually predicting their eventual failure due to inadequate resources or unrealistic business models. But Meridian has been successful enough to secure major contracts, I pointed out. So far, Michael agreed. Though sustaining that success requires continuing to deliver exceptional results and maintaining strong client relationships. Something in his tone suggested that Meridian's success wasn't entirely secure, despite their impressive recent performance. I wondered if competing with established firms like Harrison Construction created ongoing challenges that weren't apparent from the outside. What would partnering with Blueprint Interiors look like practically? I asked, steering the conversation back toward specific collaboration opportunities. Michael pulled up project timelines on his tablet. The first project would be the West Side mixed-use development. Meridian has secured the contract, and we need an interior design partner who can handle comprehensive space planning for office areas, retail spaces, and common areas. The West Side project. I remembered Richard mentioning this development during recent family dinners as a priority target for Harrison Construction. According to Michael, Meridian had already secured the contract that Richard's company had been pursuing. When would this project begin? I asked. Design phase starts in 6 weeks, with construction beginning early next year. The timeline is aggressive, but the client is motivated to move quickly. And the other projects you mentioned? Buckhead office complex starting next spring, and the downtown mixed-use development beginning next summer. All 3 projects would establish Blueprint Interiors as the premier commercial design firm in Atlanta. The scope of opportunity was staggering. 3 major projects would transform Blueprint Interiors from a struggling startup into a significant player in Atlanta's commercial design market. It would also provide the financial stability and professional credibility I'd been working toward since starting the company. Michael, I have to ask, does my connection to the Harrison family create any complications for these partnerships? He considered the question carefully. Not from Meridian's perspective. We evaluate design partners based on talent and capability, not family relationships. However, I imagine working with us might create some tension in your personal life. The understatement was significant. If Richard discovered that I was partnering with his former employee's competing company, especially on projects Harrison Construction had been pursuing, the family dynamics would become considerably more complicated. Richard doesn't know we're meeting today? I asked. No, and I'd suggest keeping our initial discussions confidential until you've decided how you want to proceed. This kind of business opportunity can be sensitive when family relationships are involved. Michael's advice was practical, but it also highlighted the difficult position I was in. Partnering with Meridian Development would advance my career goals significantly, but it would also mean actively competing with my father-in-law's company without his knowledge. Can I think about this for a few days? I asked. The opportunity is incredible, but I need to consider all the implications. Of course, Michael agreed. But I should mention that we're hoping to finalize our design partnership within the next 2 weeks. The project timelines don't allow for extended decision-making periods. We exchanged contact information and agreed to speak again early the following week. As I drove back to my studio, I tried to process the complexity of what Michael had offered. On one hand, partnering with Meridian Development represented everything I'd been working toward professionally. The projects were exactly the kind of high-profile commercial work that would establish Blueprint Interiors as a serious player in Atlanta's design market. The financial stability would allow me to expand the team, invest in better equipment, and take creative risks without worrying about paying rent. On the other hand, accepting Michael's partnership would mean directly competing with Richard Harrison's company, likely without his knowledge, while using information and opportunities that came from Michael's inside knowledge of Harrison Construction's operations and strategies. The ethical implications troubled me almost as much as the personal complications. Was I considering this partnership because it represented genuine professional opportunity, or because it offered a way to compete with Richard after years of feeling dismissed and marginalized by him? Back at the studio, Lisa immediately noticed my distracted mood. "How did the meeting go?" she asked, looking up from the residential project she was reviewing. "Complicated," I replied, settling into my desk chair. "Much more complicated than I expected." I outlined the basics of my conversation with Michael, focusing on the professional opportunities while downplaying the personal connections to Richard Harrison. Lisa's excitement about the potential partnership was infectious, but it also reminded me how much Blueprint Interiors needed this kind of breakthrough opportunity. "Emma, these projects could change everything for us," Lisa said after I'd described the scope of work. 3 major commercial developments would establish our reputation indefinitely. "I know," I agreed, "but there are some complications I need to work through." "What kind of complications?" I hadn't told Lisa about Michael's history with Harrison Construction, or the fact that Meridian had been competing directly with Richard's company. The information felt too sensitive to share without Michael's explicit permission, and I wasn't sure how to explain the family dynamics involved. "Just some potential conflicts with other Atlanta development companies," I said vaguely. "I want to make sure we're not creating problems by accepting certain partnerships." Lisa frowned slightly, probably sensing that I wasn't sharing the complete story. But she didn't press for details, perhaps recognizing that I was still processing whatever had happened during the meeting. "Whatever the complications are," she said finally, "remember that Blueprint Interiors deserves opportunities like this. You've worked incredibly hard to build this company, and you shouldn't let other people's politics prevent you from achieving your professional goals." Her support meant everything to me, but it also highlighted the central tension I was facing. Was accepting Michael's partnership a legitimate business decision, or was I allowing personal frustrations with Richard Harrison to influence my professional judgment? That evening, I arrived home to find Jake working late on his laptop, as had become his routine. Our apartment felt increasingly like a hotel, where 2 busy people occasionally crossed paths, rather than a home where a married couple built a life together. "How was your day?" he asked, his standard greeting delivered without looking up from his screen. "Interesting," I replied. "I had a meeting about a potential partnership for Blueprint Interiors." "That's good," Jake said absently. "Dad mentioned that Harrison Construction is finalizing contracts for several major projects this quarter. Busy time for Atlanta commercial development." The casual mention of his father's business success stung slightly, particularly given my new knowledge that Meridian Development had apparently secured at least one contract Richard's company had been pursuing. "What projects is Harrison Construction working on?" I asked, curious whether Jake would mention the West Side development. "The big one is the downtown office complex near the Georgia Dome site. Dad's really excited about that one because it's high profile and could lead to more downtown contracts." Jake hadn't mentioned the West Side project, which suggested either that Harrison Construction hadn't been seriously pursuing it, or that Jake wasn't privy to all of his father's business development efforts. "Any other major projects?" I pressed gently. "He's been working on a couple others, but I don't think anything's been finalized yet. You know how Dad is about not discussing deals until contracts are signed." I nodded, recognizing Richard's cautious approach to sharing business information. But Jake's response also suggested that he might not know about Harrison Construction losing the West Side project to Meridian Development. "Have you heard of a company called Meridian Development?" I asked, testing whether Jake was aware of Michael's company. Jake looked up from his laptop with a slight frown. "No, I don't think so. Why?" "They came up during my meeting today as another firm working on Atlanta commercial projects. I was just curious if your father had mentioned them." "Dad doesn't usually talk about smaller competitors unless they're causing specific problems," Jake replied. "There are always new development companies starting up and trying to break into the Atlanta market." His dismissive tone echoed his father's general attitude toward newer companies, and it reinforced my sense that the Harrison family viewed Meridian Development as irrelevant to their business interests. The conversation drifted toward other topics, but I found myself analyzing everything Jake said for insights into Harrison Construction's current projects and competitive landscape. The information felt important in ways I couldn't fully articulate, though I recognized that my new knowledge about Michael and Meridian had changed how I processed details about Richard's business. Later that night, as Jake slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about the decision I was facing. Michael's partnership offer represented the professional breakthrough I'd been working toward for years, but accepting it would mean crossing lines I hadn't previously considered crossing. Was I prepared to compete directly with my father-in-law's company, potentially using information and opportunities that came from Michael's inside knowledge of Harrison Construction? Was I ready to keep significant professional partnerships secret from my husband? And most importantly, was I making this decision based on sound business judgment or emotional reactions to years of feeling dismissed and marginalized by Richard Harrison? The questions didn't have easy answers, but I realized that my willingness to even consider Michael's offer represented a fundamental shift in how I viewed my relationship with the Harrison family and my own professional autonomy. For the first time since marrying Jake, I was seriously contemplating major career decisions without considering Richard's opinions or potential reactions. The liberation felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like stepping away from a life I'd accepted toward one I wasn't sure I was ready to embrace. But Michael's deadline was approaching, and Blueprint Interiors needed the kind of breakthrough opportunity he was offering. Whether I was ready or not, I would need to decide soon how far I was willing to go to achieve the professional success I'd been pursuing. The game was changing, and I was discovering that I might be more willing to play it than I'd previously realized. The decision crystallized during a particularly brutal Harrison family dinner the following Saturday evening. Jake and I had arrived at the Buckhead estate to find Richard in an expansive mood, regaling the assembled family and guests with stories of Harrison Construction's latest victories in Atlanta's competitive development market. "The key to success in this business," Richard declared, gesturing with his wineglass toward the group of business associates gathered around the dinner table, "is understanding that real estate development isn't about pretty pictures and creative concepts. It's about execution, relationships, and the backbone to deliver what you promise." The pointed reference to, quote, "pretty pictures and creative concepts" was clearly aimed at me, though Richard maintained his practice of insulting me indirectly rather than through direct confrontation. Sarah, sitting across the table in her role as devoted daughter and business protege, nodded approvingly at her father's wisdom. "Experience matters more than education in this industry," Sarah added, her gaze briefly meeting mine with the kind of calculated sweetness that made her comments particularly effective. "Clients want partners who understand real-world constraints, not theoretical design principles." Jake, sitting beside me, offered no response to his sister's veiled criticism of my background. His silence had become so consistent that I no longer expected him to defend me during these family gatherings, but the absence of support still stung. "Speaking of real-world results," Richard continued, "Harrison Construction just secured the preliminary agreement for the downtown office complex project, $15 million in construction contracts, with potential for additional phases if the initial development meets performance targets." The announcement prompted congratulations from around the table. Richard basked in the attention while sharing selected details about the project's scope and significance. As he described Harrison Construction's plans for the development, I found myself analyzing his approach through the lens of everything Michael had told me about the company's traditional methods and resistance to innovation. The client specifically chose Harrison Construction because they wanted a reliable, proven approach rather than experimental concepts, Richard emphasized, his eyes finding mine across the table. They'd seen too many projects fail because developers tried to reinvent established processes. The familiar refrain about experimental concepts had become Richard's standard way of dismissing any approach that deviated from his preferred methods. But armed with Michael's insights about changing market trends and client expectations, I found myself questioning whether Richard's confidence in traditional approaches was as justified as he believed. "What kind of timeline is the client working with?" asked David Caldwell, who had been invited to dinner as a potential collaborator on future projects. "Aggressive but manageable," Richard replied. "They want to begin construction within 6 months, which is exactly the kind of schedule that separates serious development companies from amateur operations." 6 months seems optimistic for a project that size, David observed diplomatically. "Have you identified your subcontractor teams?" Richard's expression tightened slightly at the suggestion that his timeline might be challenging. "Harrison Construction has established relationships with all the specialty contractors we'll need. That's the advantage of being in this business for 30 years rather than trying to build a network from scratch. The exchange reminded me of Michael's comments about Richard's resistance to acknowledging potential obstacles or alternative approaches. Even friendly questions about practical challenges seemed to trigger defensive responses that emphasized Harrison Construction's superior experience and resources. After dinner, while the adults moved to the living room for coffee and continued business discussion, I excused myself to get some air on the terrace. The October evening was crisp and clear, with Atlanta's skyline visible in the distance. Standing alone in the cool air, I felt the weight of the decision I'd been avoiding for the past week. Michael's partnership offer represented more than just professional opportunity. It was a chance to prove that innovative design approaches could succeed in Atlanta's commercial development market. But accepting his offer would also mean actively competing with Richard Harrison, while keeping that competition secret from my husband and his family. Penny, for your thoughts? Jake's voice interrupted my contemplation as he stepped onto the terrace behind me. Just enjoying the view, I replied, not turning around. It's a beautiful night. Jake moved to stand beside me, his hands in his pockets as he gazed out at the city lights. Dad's really excited about the downtown project. He thinks it could lead to more high-profile contracts in that area. That's wonderful for him, I said, meaning it sincerely despite everything else. Richard's professional success wasn't something I wanted to undermine simply because of personal conflicts. He mentioned that he might need to bring in additional project management help if the development phases continue as planned, Jake continued. Could be a good opportunity for me to take on more responsibility. I turned to study Jake's profile in the dim light from the house. His focus on advancement within his father's company had intensified over the past year, and conversations about his own career goals had become increasingly rare. What would you want to do if you weren't working for your father? I asked gently. Jake frowned, as if the question didn't make sense. But I am working for him. Harrison Construction is the family business. I know, but hypothetically, if you could design any career path, what would it look like? Emma, this is my career path. Dad's built something incredible, and I'm fortunate to be part of it. Why would I want to do something else? The response troubled me, because it suggested Jake had stopped thinking of his work in terms of personal interests or goals. His identity had become so intertwined with Harrison Construction that he couldn't imagine professional fulfillment outside his father's framework. You used to talk about wanting to innovate construction methods, bring new technologies to traditional building processes, I reminded him. Remember when we first met? You had all those ideas about sustainable development and smart building systems? Jake's expression became uncomfortable, as if I was bringing up embarrassing memories from a less mature period of his life. Those were graduate school fantasies. Real business requires practical approaches, not theoretical concepts. The echo of his father's language was unmistakable. Jake had absorbed Richard's perspective so completely that he was now repeating it as his own philosophy, apparently, without recognizing the transformation. Jake, I said carefully, do you remember what you originally found appealing about my design work? Of course I do. You're talented at creating beautiful spaces. You used to say I was talented at solving functional problems through creative solutions. You said my approach to space planning could revolutionize how people interact with built environments. Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that his current dismissal of innovative approaches contradicted his earlier enthusiasm for my work. I still think you're talented, Emma, but I've learned more about market realities since then. Market realities according to whom? According to Dad, obviously. He's been successful in this industry for decades. The conversation crystallized my understanding of how completely Jake had surrendered his independent thinking to his father's influence. The man I'd married had been curious, innovative, and supportive of creative approaches to business challenges. The man standing beside me now was a careful echo of Richard Harrison's opinions and priorities. We stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. When Jake finally spoke, his words confirmed what I'd been reluctantly accepting about the state of our marriage. Dad thinks it might be time for us to consider buying a house in Buckhead, closer to the family and the business. He's identified several properties that would be good investments and appropriate for our position in the community. Our position in the community. Not our personal preferences or lifestyle goals, but our appropriate position as determined by Richard Harrison's social calculations. Have you seen these properties? I asked. Dad showed me a few last week. Traditional styles, good neighborhoods, the kind of places that appreciate in value consistently. What about what we want? What kind of home appeals to us personally? Jake looked puzzled by the question. These are exactly the kind of homes we should want. Dad has excellent judgment about real estate investments. The conversation ended shortly afterward when Sarah appeared on the terrace to retrieve Jake for a discussion about upcoming Harrison Construction Board meetings. I remained outside alone, watching Atlanta's lights twinkle in the distance, while processing the full extent of Jake's transformation. My husband had become a stranger, who valued his father's approval more than his wife's partnership, who had replaced his own dreams with inherited expectations, and who could no longer imagine success outside the framework Richard had constructed for him. The realization was heartbreaking but also liberating. If Jake was determined to become a duplicate of his father, then I needed to stop waiting for him to remember who he'd been before Richard's influence consumed his identity. Monday morning, I called Michael Chen and accepted his partnership offer. "I'm delighted to hear that, Emma," Michael said when I confirmed my decision. "I believe this collaboration will be beneficial for both Blueprint Interiors and Meridian Development. When can we begin working on the specific project details?" I asked, ready to move forward decisively. "How about lunch today? I'd like to discuss strategy and timeline, and there are some aspects of our partnership that require careful coordination." We met at a small restaurant in Decatur, far enough from Atlanta's main business districts to ensure privacy while discussing sensitive collaboration details. Michael had prepared comprehensive project documentation, but our conversation quickly moved beyond basic logistics toward deeper strategic considerations. "Before we dive into project specifics," Michael said once we'd ordered, "I want to make sure you understand the competitive dynamics involved in our partnership." "What do you mean?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Meridian Development's success in Atlanta has been built partly on identifying opportunities where established firms like Harrison Construction are vulnerable to more innovative competitors." "Vulnerable how?" "Richard Harrison built his company during a period when Atlanta's commercial development market was smaller and less sophisticated. Clients accepted standard approaches because alternatives weren't readily available. But the market has evolved significantly in recent years." Michael explained that Atlanta's rapid growth and increasing national profile had attracted more sophisticated clients with higher expectations for design integration, sustainable building practices, and innovative space planning. Many established development companies, including Harrison Construction, had been slow to adapt to these changing requirements. "Richard still approaches every project as if it's 1995, Michael continued. "Standard office layouts, minimal design integration, focus on lowest-cost construction methods. Those approaches work for some clients, but many others are looking for more sophisticated solutions. And that's where Meridian Development has found opportunities?" "Exactly. We identify projects where clients are dissatisfied with traditional approaches and offer them genuine alternatives, better design integration, more flexible building systems, enhanced sustainability features." The strategy made sense from a business perspective, but it also meant that my partnership with Meridian would directly compete with Harrison Construction by offering clients the innovative approaches that Richard dismissed as impractical. "How often does this put Meridian in direct competition with Harrison Construction?" I asked. Michael's smile was slight but telling. "More often than Richard realizes. He tends to assume that clients who don't choose Harrison Construction are making decisions based on price rather than quality. He doesn't recognize that they might prefer different approaches to development. So some of the projects Meridian has secured were also being pursued by Harrison Construction? Several of them, yes, including the West Side development, where Blueprint Interiors will be handling interior design." The revelation was both thrilling and unsettling. I was about to begin work on a project that Richard's company had wanted but lost to Michael's more innovative approach. The victory felt satisfying after years of listening to Richard dismiss creative solutions as commercially impractical. "Does Richard know that Meridian secured the West Side project?" I asked. "Not specifically. Harrison Construction submitted a proposal, but they weren't selected for the final round of presentations. Richard probably assumes they lost because of pricing or timing rather than approach. Michael pulled out his tablet and showed me internal communications from the West Side project selection process. The client had explicitly rejected Harrison Construction's proposal as overly traditional and lacking innovation in space planning and design integration. They wanted something more sophisticated than standard office layouts and retail space, Michael explained. That's exactly what our Meridian Blueprint partnership can deliver. Reading the client's feedback on Harrison Construction's proposal was illuminating. They had described Richard's approach as, quote, competent but uninspiring, and noted concerns about, quote, inflexibility in design adaptation, and limited integration between architectural and interior design elements. This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to Richard about the value of innovative design thinking, I said, studying the client comments. But he insists that clients prefer traditional approaches. Richard believes what he needs to believe to avoid acknowledging that his methods might be outdated, Michael replied. It's easier to dismiss innovative approaches as impractical than to admit that the market has moved beyond his comfort zone. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as Michael outlined Meridian's broader competitive strategy and my role in executing it. The partnership involved more than just interior design services. Blueprint Interiors would become Meridian's preferred design collaborator, helping to create the kind of comprehensive development solutions that differentiated them from traditional construction companies. The key to our success, Michael explained, is demonstrating that innovative approaches deliver better results for clients, not just more creative satisfaction for designers. Every project needs to prove that design integration enhances functionality and profitability. The emphasis on measurable results appealed to my analytical side. Too often, commercial design was treated as decorative enhancement rather than strategic business investment. Michael's approach required me to think more rigorously about how design decisions impacted client outcomes. What kind of results are we talking about? I asked. Michael showed me performance data from previous Meridian projects, including metrics on employee productivity, customer engagement, and space utilization efficiency. The numbers were impressive, consistently showing 15 to 20% improvements in various performance measures compared to traditionally designed spaces. This data is what allows us to charge premium rates while delivering better client satisfaction, Michael said. We're not just asking clients to pay more for prettier spaces. We're delivering measurable business value through superior design integration. The approach was exactly what I'd been trying to achieve with Blueprint Interiors, but I'd lacked the project scale and data collection resources to prove the business value of design innovation. Partnering with Meridian would give me access to both. How do we handle the situation with Richard and Harrison Construction? I asked as our lunch concluded. I assume this partnership needs to remain confidential for now. Michael nodded thoughtfully. For the immediate term, yes. Richard doesn't need to know about our collaboration until it becomes unavoidable. By that time, we'll have established a track record that speaks for itself. When do you think it will become unavoidable? Probably within the next 6 months. Once Blueprint Interiors' association with multiple Meridian projects becomes visible in industry publications and client communications. But by then you'll have the portfolio and reputation to handle any family complications that arise. The timeline felt both reassuring and anxiety-provoking. 6 months would give me time to establish the partnership and demonstrate its value. But it also meant 6 months of keeping significant professional activities secret from Jake and his family. Can you give me specific guidance on how to handle information sharing with my husband? I asked. I don't want to lie to Jake, but I also can't discuss confidential business details. Michael considered the question carefully. My suggestion is to focus on Blueprint Interiors' growth and new projects without detailing client relationships or competitive dynamics. Jake doesn't need to know that Meridian is competing directly with Harrison Construction unless he specifically asks. The advice was practical but highlighted the increasingly complex dynamics I was navigating between my professional goals and personal relationships. Accepting Michael's partnership meant embracing a level of strategic thinking and competitive awareness that was new territory for me. That evening, I returned to my studio with renewed energy and a clear sense of direction for the first time in months. Lisa immediately noticed the change in my mood. "You look like someone who just made an important decision," she observed, looking up from the residential project proposals scattered across her desk. "I accepted the Meridian Development Partnership," I confirmed. "Blueprint Interiors is about to become the interior design partner for 3 major commercial projects over the next 18 months. Lisa's excitement was immediate and infectious. "Emma, that's incredible. Tell me everything." I outlined the scope of work and project timelines, focusing on the professional opportunities while avoiding details about Michael's background or the competitive dynamics with Harrison Construction. Lisa's questions were primarily practical, covering staffing needs, equipment requirements, and cash flow implications. "We'll need to hire at least 2 additional designers and probably a project coordinator," Lisa calculated, reviewing the project schedules. "And we'll need more sophisticated presentation software and 3D modeling capabilities." Michael mentioned that Meridian has relationships with technology vendors who can provide equipment leasing and software licensing at preferred rates, I said. "Part of the partnership includes access to professional resources that would normally be beyond our budget." "This partnership is going to transform Blueprint Interiors completely," Lisa said with a grin. 6 months from now, we'll be one of the most prominent commercial design firms in Atlanta." Her enthusiasm reinforced my confidence in the decision, but it also reminded me how much was riding on the success of this collaboration. Failure would mean not just professional disappointment, but potential damage to the reputation I'd spent years building. Over the following weeks, Michael and I developed detailed project plans for the West Side development, while laying groundwork for the subsequent Buckhead and downtown projects. The collaboration exceeded my expectations in terms of both creative satisfaction and professional challenge. Michael's approach to development emphasized comprehensive integration between architectural planning, interior design, and building systems. Instead of treating interior design as decoration applied to completed construction, Meridian involved designers in fundamental space planning decisions that influenced structural and mechanical systems. Most developers think about interior design during the final 10% of the project timeline, Michael explained during one of our planning sessions. "We integrate design thinking into the first 10%, when decisions about space allocation and systems planning can actually enhance functionality." The methodology required me to think more strategically about how design decisions impacted building performance, client operations, and long-term maintenance costs. It was intellectually demanding work that pushed me beyond the aesthetic considerations that had dominated my previous projects. "This is what commercial design should be," I told Lisa after a particularly productive planning session with Michael and the West Side project client. "We're not just making spaces look better, we're making them work better." The West Side client had specifically chosen Meridian's team because they wanted office spaces that could adapt to changing business needs over time. Traditional office design locked companies into fixed layouts that became obsolete as operations evolved. Our approach created flexible infrastructure that could support multiple layout configurations without requiring major reconstruction. The client estimates that our design approach will save them approximately $200,000 in reconfiguration costs over the first 5 years of operation, I reported to Lisa. "That's the kind of measurable value that justifies premium design fees and establishes Blueprint Interiors as a strategic business partner rather than just a service provider," Lisa added. "This changes how we'll be perceived by future clients." The work was professionally fulfilling in ways I hadn't experienced since starting Blueprint Interiors, but it also required managing increasingly complex personal dynamics at home. Jake had noticed my improved mood and renewed enthusiasm for work, but his questions about the source of these changes required careful navigation. "Your business seems to be picking up lately," he observed one evening as I worked on project documents at our kitchen table. "You seem more excited about work than you have in months." "We've secured some interesting new projects," I replied truthfully. "Commercial work that's challenging and rewarding." "That's great. What kind of projects?" "Mixed-use developments, office complexes, the kind of comprehensive design work that really showcases what Blueprint Interiors can do." Jake nodded approvingly. "Dad always says that commercial work is more stable than residential projects. Better clients, more predictable revenue." The irony of Jake citing his father's business wisdom while unknowingly describing my partnership with Richard's primary competitor was painful, but also revealing. Jake's complete trust in his father's perspective prevented him from asking the more detailed questions that might have uncovered the full scope of my new professional activities. "How did you identify these new clients?" Jake asked, returning to his laptop while continuing the conversation. "Professional networking, industry contacts, the usual business development activities," I replied, technically accurate if deliberately vague. Dad's always emphasized the importance of networking in commercial development. It's all about relationships and reputation. I agreed with the general principle while privately noting that my most important business relationship was with someone who had left Harrison Construction due to irreconcilable differences with Jake's father. As Blueprint Interiors began work on the West Side project, I found myself learning more about Harrison Construction's operations and competitive position than I'd ever known as Richard's daughter-in-law. Michael's insights into the company's strengths and weaknesses provided a comprehensive understanding of why Meridian had been successful in winning contracts that Richard's firm had pursued. Harrison Construction's fundamental problem, Michael explained during one of our strategy sessions, is that Richard refuses to acknowledge how much the commercial development market has changed. He still operates as if Atlanta is a small city with limited client options. What would he need to do differently to remain competitive? Invest in design integration capabilities, develop partnerships with innovative subcontractors, train his project managers to think beyond standard building approaches. Basically everything he's been refusing to do for the past 5 years. Michael's analysis suggested that Harrison Construction's declining competitiveness was largely self-inflicted, rather than the result of market forces beyond Richard's control. The revelation was both satisfying and sobering, confirming that my frustrations with Richard's dismissive attitude toward innovation had been justified, while highlighting how much damage his resistance to change was causing his own company. "Is Richard aware that Harrison Construction is losing projects to more innovative competitors?" I asked. "He blames losses on pricing pressure and unrealistic client expectations, rather than acknowledging that other firms are offering superior solutions," Michael replied. "It's easier to criticize clients than to examine his own methods." The pattern was familiar from every family gathering where Richard dismissed unsuccessful projects as the result of client ignorance or competitor dishonesty, rather than superior approaches to development challenges. How long can Harrison Construction continue operating this way before facing serious consequences? Michael's expression became thoughtful. "Richard's reputation and established relationships will protect the company for a while, but Atlanta's commercial development market is becoming increasingly competitive. Eventually, clients will stop accepting traditional approaches when better alternatives are readily available." How eventually? 18 to 24 months, assuming current market trends continue. Maybe longer if Richard adapts, but that seems unlikely given his resistance to change. The timeline was sobering. If Michael's assessment was accurate, Harrison Construction faced significant challenges within the next 2 years, unless Richard acknowledged the need for operational changes. Jake's career plans, which assumed continued expansion and success for his father's company, might require fundamental revision. But those concerns felt distant compared to the immediate satisfaction of working on projects that challenged my abilities and delivered measurable results for clients. The West Side development was progressing ahead of schedule, and early client feedback on our design integration approach was overwhelmingly positive. "The client wants to schedule a progress presentation for their board of directors," Michael reported during our weekly coordination meeting. "They're so pleased with the design development that they want to use our approach as a model for future projects." "When is the presentation scheduled?" "Next month. And they've specifically requested that you present the interior design components, since that's where most of the innovation is concentrated." The opportunity to present to a major client's board represented a significant step forward in establishing my reputation as a strategic design partner rather than just a service provider. But it also meant increased visibility that might eventually reach Richard Harrison's attention. "Will the presentation receive any industry publicity?" I asked, thinking about potential exposure that might complicate family relationships. "Probably. The client is proud of their innovative approach to this development, and they've been vocal about the benefits of integrated design planning. It's possible that trade publications will cover the project." The prospect of professional recognition was thrilling, but it also meant that my partnership with Meridian Development would soon become public knowledge in Atlanta's commercial development community. Richard would inevitably learn about my collaboration with his former employee and primary competitor. Michael, I said as our meeting concluded, I think we need to discuss contingency plans for when my family discovers the nature of our partnership. What kind of contingency plans? How to handle the inevitable confrontation with my father-in-law, and how to protect Blueprint Interiors if that confrontation becomes problematic. Michael's expression became serious. Emma, you should know that Richard Harrison can be vindictive when he feels betrayed or undermined. If he discovers our partnership, he may try to damage your reputation in the local business community. What could he actually do? Spread negative information about your work? Question your professionalism with mutual contacts? Potentially interfere with future client relationships? Richard has extensive connections in Atlanta's development community, and he's not above using them to punish people he perceives as disloyal. The warning was sobering, but not entirely surprising. I'd witnessed Richard's capacity for grudges and his talent for subtle character assassination during family gatherings, where he discussed business competitors and former employees who had disappointed him. Are you saying I should reconsider our partnership? Not at all, Michael replied firmly. I'm saying you should be prepared for the consequences of success. Richard will eventually realize that Blueprint Interiors represents the kind of innovative design thinking he's been dismissing as commercially impractical. When that happens, he won't respond gracefully. The conversation highlighted how much my life was about to change as a result of my professional success. I was gaining the career satisfaction and business recognition I'd worked toward for years, but I was also moving toward an inevitable confrontation with my husband's family that would reshape all of our relationships. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how completely my priorities had shifted over the past month. The partnership with Michael had given me not just professional opportunities, but also clarity about what kind of life I wanted to build for myself. I was no longer willing to accept Richard Harrison's limitations on my career goals or his dismissive attitude toward my capabilities. I was no longer content to subordinate my professional development to family political considerations. And I was no longer interested in waiting for Jake to remember who he'd been before his father's influence transformed him into a compliant replica. The game had changed, and for the first time since marrying into the Harrison family, I was the one making the moves. The first domino fell 3 weeks after my presentation to the Westside Development Board. I was reviewing fabric samples in my expanded studio space when Lisa burst through the door with her laptop, her face flushed with excitement and disbelief. Emma, you need to see this immediately, she said, setting her computer on my desk and pulling up an email. Cornerstone Properties just contacted us directly about their Buckhead project. I stared at the screen, reading the message twice to make sure I understood correctly. Cornerstone Properties, the same company that had rejected Blueprint Interiors 6 months ago for being too innovative, was now requesting a comprehensive proposal for their upcoming luxury office complex. They specifically mentioned wanting, quote, cutting-edge design integration and flexible workspace solutions, Lisa continued, scrolling through the detailed project requirements. This is exactly the kind of language Meridian uses in their client presentations. The timing wasn't coincidental. Michael had mentioned during our last coordination meeting that several Atlanta developers were beginning to recognize the competitive advantages of innovative design approaches, particularly after seeing the early results from our Westside project. Word was spreading through the commercial development community that integrated design planning was delivering measurable benefits for clients. What's the project timeline? I asked, my mind already racing through the implications of landing another major contract. They want initial concepts within 3 weeks, final proposals by the end of next month. The scope includes 15 floors of office space, ground-level retail, and a conference center. Estimated design budget is $400,000. The number was staggering. $400,000 represented more revenue than Blueprint Interiors had generated in the previous 18 months combined. More importantly, Cornerstone Properties was one of Atlanta's most prestigious development companies, and their endorsement would establish my firm's credibility indefinitely. There's something else, Lisa said, her expression becoming more complex. I did some research on Cornerstone's previous projects, and they've worked exclusively with Harrison Construction for the past 5 years. This Buckhead project was supposed to be another automatic partnership. Was supposed to be? According to the construction industry newsletters, Harrison Construction submitted their standard proposal package, but Cornerstone rejected it last week. They cited concerns about, quote, outdated approaches to modern workplace requirements, and, quote, insufficient integration between construction and design planning. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. Harrison Construction had lost another major contract, this time specifically because clients were demanding the innovative approaches that Richard Harrison continued to dismiss as impractical. But this loss was different from the Westside project because it involved a long-time client relationship, which meant Richard would be forced to confront the reality that his methods were becoming obsolete. Does Jake know about Harrison Construction losing the Cornerstone contract? I asked, realizing this setback would directly affect his father's business and potentially his own career advancement. I'm not sure. The industry publications only mentioned it briefly, and they focused more on Cornerstone's search for alternative development partners than on why they rejected Harrison Construction. That evening, I waited to see if Jake would mention anything about his father's business challenges. He arrived home later than usual, his expression tense in a way that suggested he'd had a difficult day. While I prepared dinner, he sat at our kitchen table reviewing emails on his phone with the kind of focused intensity that indicated crisis management. Rough day? I asked, giving him an opening to discuss whatever was troubling him. Dad's dealing with some client relationship issues, Jake replied without looking up from his phone. Nothing major, just some miscommunication about project requirements. The careful phrasing suggested that Harrison Construction's rejection by Cornerstone had been presented to Jake as a minor misunderstanding, rather than a fundamental disagreement about development approaches. I wondered if Richard was minimizing the significance of these contract losses to his family, or if Jake was unconsciously protecting his father's reputation by downplaying serious business problems. Anything I can help with? I offered, curious to see how much Jake actually knew about the specific issues. It's just business politics, Jake said dismissively. Some clients get influenced by trends instead of focusing on proven results. Dad's dealt with this kind of thing before. The response revealed how completely Jake had internalized his father's perspective on market changes. Instead of recognizing that clients might have legitimate reasons for preferring different development approaches, Jake assumed that any departure from Harrison Construction's traditional methods reflected poor judgment on the client's part. What kind of trends? I pressed gently. Design integration, sustainable building systems, flexible workspace planning. Buzzwords that sound impressive but add cost and complexity, without delivering practical benefits. Jake's casual dismissal of exactly the approaches that were driving Blueprint Interior's recent success was both painful and illuminating. My husband was so aligned with his father's worldview that he couldn't recognize the value of innovations that were transforming our industry. Have you seen examples of these approaches in practice? I asked, testing whether Jake's opinions were based on actual experience or inherited assumptions. Dad's explained why they don't work in real-world applications, Jake replied with the confidence of someone who had never questioned information from a trusted source. Clients get excited about creative concepts during the planning phase, but they always want traditional solutions when it comes to actual implementation and long-term maintenance. The conversation ended when Jake's phone rang with a call from Sarah about urgent Harrison Construction business. As he moved to the living room for privacy, I reflected on how disconnected my husband had become from the actual evolution of commercial development practices. Over the following weeks, Blueprint Interior's rapid growth became impossible to hide from Jake, even though I continued to avoid discussing specific client details. The studio space was bustling with new staff members, upgraded equipment, and constant client meetings. Our residential project waitlist had grown to 3 months, and our commercial portfolio was expanding beyond anything I'd previously imagined possible. Your business is really taking off, Jake observed one Saturday morning as I prepared to leave for a client presentation. You seem to be working constantly lately. Good problems to have, I replied, gathering my portfolio materials. We're finally getting the kind of projects that make all the startup struggles worthwhile. Dad mentioned that the Atlanta commercial design market has been competitive lately. Lots of new firms trying to break into established client relationships. The comment suggested that Richard was beginning to notice increased competition in the design space, though he probably didn't realize that some of that competition was coming from his own daughter-in-law. Competition usually indicates a healthy market, I said diplomatically. More options for clients, more opportunities for firms that deliver exceptional work. Jake nodded absently, but I could see him processing the implications of my comment. His business school training had taught him to analyze market dynamics, and he was beginning to recognize that Blueprint Interior's success represented more than just fortunate timing. Have you considered expanding into larger commercial projects? Jake asked. With your reputation growing, you might be able to compete for some of the major developments that bigger firms usually handle. The question was particularly ironic given that Blueprint Interiors was already working on exactly those kinds of projects through my partnership with Meridian Development. But Jake's suggestion also revealed that he was starting to take my business more seriously than he had in previous years. That's definitely a possibility, I agreed. The right partnerships could open doors to projects that would establish Blueprint Interiors as a major player in Atlanta commercial design. You'd need to be careful about partnership arrangements, Jake cautioned, unconsciously echoing his father's concerns about business relationships. Dad always says that successful companies maintain control over their core operations, rather than depending too heavily on outside collaborators. Different business models work for different companies, I replied, recognizing that Jake's advice reflected Harrison Construction's preference for maintaining tight control over all aspects of their projects rather than embracing collaborative approaches. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Michael about an urgent development regarding our next major opportunity. I excused myself to take the call, stepping onto our apartment balcony for privacy. "Emma, I have news that will interest you," Michael said when I called him back. Atlanta Metro Development just terminated their contract with Harrison Construction for the Airport District project. Terminated? What happened? Performance issues and budget overruns. Harrison Construction's traditional project management approach wasn't flexible enough to handle the technical complexity of building near an active airport. The client lost confidence in their ability to deliver on schedule and within budget. The Airport District project was a massive undertaking that Richard had been pursuing for over a year. According to family dinner conversations, Harrison Construction viewed this contract as a cornerstone of their expansion strategy, with potential for multiple construction phases over the next decade. How much revenue was Harrison Construction expecting from this project, I asked. Initial phase was worth approximately $25 million, with total project value potentially reaching $75 million over 5 years. This is a significant blow to their growth projections. The magnitude of the loss was staggering. Richard had built his expansion plans around securing large-scale, multi-year contracts like the Airport District project. Losing this opportunity would force major revisions to Harrison Construction's strategic timeline and potentially their staffing plans. Is Atlanta Metro Development looking for alternative contractors? I asked, sensing that Michael might have additional information about the client's next steps. They're evaluating firms that specialize in complex technical projects with integrated design and construction management. Meridian Development has been invited to submit a proposal. And if Meridian secures the contract? It would be our largest project to date, and it would require comprehensive interior design services for terminal facilities, office complexes, and retail spaces. Blueprint Interiors would be the obvious choice for design partnership. The opportunity was enormous, representing the kind of career-defining project that could establish Blueprint Interiors as one of the Southeast's premier commercial design firms. But it would also mean directly benefiting from Harrison Construction's most significant contract loss, which would inevitably create family complications that couldn't be avoided or minimized. Michael, if we move forward with this opportunity, Richard will definitely discover our partnership. The Airport District project is too high profile to keep confidential. I know, Michael replied. Are you prepared for that confrontation? I considered the question carefully, weighing my professional ambitions against the personal consequences of open conflict with my father-in-law. 6 months ago, the prospect of confronting Richard would have seemed impossible. But my partnership with Michael had given me confidence in my abilities and clarity about my professional goals that changed my tolerance for family political considerations. Yes, I said finally, I'm prepared. Then let's win this contract and transform both of our companies. The following month brought a series of developments that accelerated the timeline for my inevitable confrontation with the Harrison family. Blueprint Interiors secured the Cornerstone Properties contract, opened a second office location to handle our expanding commercial portfolio, and hired 4 additional staff members to manage our growing project load. More significantly, Atlanta business publications began featuring Blueprint Interiors in articles about emerging design firms that were reshaping the commercial development landscape. My photograph appeared in Atlanta Business Chronicle alongside an interview where I discussed the benefits of integrated design planning and the importance of creating adaptable commercial spaces. Emma, you're becoming famous, Lisa said excitedly, showing me the latest industry newsletter that featured Blueprint Interiors as one of Atlanta's design firms to watch. 3 major publications have mentioned us in the past month. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it also made my business activities increasingly visible to anyone connected to Atlanta's commercial development community. Richard Harrison subscribed to all the major industry publications, and he made it his business to track competitor activities and market trends. Has Jake seen any of these articles? Lisa asked, noting my concerned expression. Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. He doesn't usually read industry publications unless his father mentions something specific, but this level of coverage will eventually reach his attention. That evening, Jake surprised me by arriving home with a bottle of champagne and a congratulatory smile. I heard some interesting news today, he said, presenting the bottle with obvious pride. Dad mentioned that Blueprint Interiors has been getting some impressive press coverage lately. My heart jumped. Richard mentioned my business? He saw the Atlanta Business Chronicle article and was actually quite complimentary about your success. He said it reflected well on the Harrison family to have such an accomplished entrepreneur in our circle. The response was unexpected. I'd assumed that Richard's first reaction to my professional recognition would be skepticism or criticism, rather than pride. But perhaps he was beginning to acknowledge that my business achievements were legitimate, rather than temporary good fortune. What specifically did he say? I asked, curious about Richard's actual comments versus Jake's filtered interpretation. He said you'd obviously found your niche in the design market, and that your success proved the value of persistence and hard work. He even mentioned that Harrison Construction might consider collaborating with Blueprint Interiors on future projects, if the right opportunities arose. The possibility of working directly with Harrison Construction was both appealing and complicated, given my existing partnership with Meridian Development. I wondered if Richard's openness to collaboration reflected genuine respect for my work or strategic thinking about keeping potential competitors within his sphere of influence. Did he mention specific types of collaboration? I asked. Nothing concrete, just general comments about the benefits of working with established local design talent, rather than bringing in outside firms for major projects. Jake's enthusiasm about potential family business collaboration was touching, but it also highlighted how completely unaware he remained of my existing commercial partnerships and the competitive dynamics that were reshaping Atlanta's development market. Our celebration was interrupted by Jake's phone ringing with an urgent call from Sarah. Jake's expression grew increasingly serious as he listened to whatever crisis required immediate family consultation. I need to go to Dad's house, Jake said after ending the call. Some kind of business emergency that requires all hands on deck. Is everything okay? Probably just another client issue. Dad's been dealing with several challenging situations lately, but nothing he can't handle. Jake left immediately, and I spent the evening wondering what crisis had prompted an emergency family meeting. My curiosity was satisfied the next morning when Atlanta Business Journal published a comprehensive article about recent changes in the commercial development market, featuring extensive coverage of Harrison Construction's recent contract losses. The article detailed Harrison Construction's rejection by 3 major clients over the past 2 months, including the Cornerstone Properties and Atlanta Metro Development projects. Industry analysts quoted in the piece suggested that established construction firms were struggling to adapt to evolving client expectations for innovative design integration and sustainable building practices. Traditional contractors who built their reputations on standard approaches are finding themselves at a competitive disadvantage, one analyst explained. Clients increasingly want partners who can deliver comprehensive solutions rather than basic construction services. The article also highlighted Meridian Development as an example of newer firms that were successfully capturing market share by offering exactly the innovative approaches that established companies had been reluctant to embrace. Meridian Development's rapid growth demonstrates that Atlanta's commercial market is ready for more sophisticated development solutions, the article concluded. Their success suggests that traditional firms will need to evolve significantly to remain competitive. Reading the article, I understood why the Harrison family had convened an emergency meeting. Richard was facing his first serious challenge to Harrison Construction's market position in decades, and the threat came from exactly the kind of innovative approaches he had spent years dismissing as commercially impractical. Jake returned home that evening looking exhausted and stressed. He moved through our apartment with the distracted energy of someone processing unexpected bad news, and his usual routine of checking emails and watching television was replaced by restless pacing and distracted conversation. "How did the family meeting go?" I asked gently, offering him a cup of coffee as he settled onto our couch. "Challenging," Jake replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Dad's dealing with some competitive pressures that require strategic adjustments to Harrison Construction's business model." "What kind of adjustments?" "Client expectations have shifted more rapidly than anticipated. Some of our traditional approaches need updating to align with current market preferences." Jake's careful language couldn't disguise the reality that Harrison Construction was struggling to compete with firms offering more innovative development solutions. But his phrasing also suggested that the family was treating these challenges as temporary market fluctuations, rather than fundamental changes requiring major operational modifications. "Is Richard considering partnerships with design firms or other specialists?" I asked, wondering if my father-in-law was beginning to recognize the value of collaborative approaches. "He's evaluating various options for enhancing Harrison Construction's service offerings," Jake replied diplomatically. "But any partnerships would need to maintain our core operational control and quality standards." The response indicated that Richard remained reluctant to embrace truly collaborative relationships that might require sharing decision-making authority, or acknowledging that outside expertise could improve Harrison Construction's competitive position. Over the following weeks, the pace of developments accelerated beyond anything I could have anticipated. Meridian Development secured the airport district contract, Blueprint Interiors was selected as the exclusive interior design partner, and our combined proposal received extensive coverage in regional business publications as an example of innovative project management approaches. The airport district project represented the largest contract in both companies' histories, with potential for additional phases that could sustain our partnership for years. More importantly, the high-profile nature of the work guaranteed that Richard Harrison would soon discover the full extent of my business relationship with his former employee and primary competitor. "Emma, we need to discuss timing for disclosure," Michael said during our weekly coordination meeting. "The airport district project will require public presentations and community input sessions, where our partnership will be visible to the entire Atlanta development community." "When is the first public presentation scheduled?" "Next month, at the Commercial Development Summit in Las Vegas. Airport project stakeholders will be presenting their approach to a national audience of industry professionals. You'll be speaking about the interior design integration strategy." The Commercial Development Summit was the industry's most prominent annual conference, attended by developers, contractors, architects, and designers from across the country. My presentation would establish Blueprint Interiors' reputation on a national level, but it would also make my partnership with Meridian Development impossible for Richard to ignore. "Will Harrison Construction be represented at the summit?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Richard is scheduled to speak on a panel about traditional construction methods and their continued relevance in modern development. He'll definitely be in the audience for our airport project presentation." The setup was perfect for the kind of dramatic confrontation that would permanently alter my relationship with the Harrison family. Richard would discover our partnership in the most public possible setting. surrounded by industry peers who would witness his reaction to learning that his daughter-in-law had been collaborating with his primary competitor. "Michael, there's something I need to ask you," I said, recognizing that this might be my last opportunity to understand the full scope of what I'd become involved in. "When you left Harrison Construction, was your departure entirely voluntary?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal about his history with Richard. "Richard fired me," he said finally. "He discovered that I'd been developing relationships with suppliers and subcontractors who were interested in more innovative project approaches. He viewed that as disloyalty to Harrison Construction's established methods." "So Meridian Development was created partly as a response to your conflict with Richard?" "Meridian was created to prove that Richard Harrison was wrong about market trends and client expectations. Every contract we've secured, every successful project we've completed, demonstrates that Atlanta's commercial development market has evolved beyond his traditional approaches." The revelation added a personal dimension to our partnership that I hadn't fully understood. Michael wasn't just competing with Harrison Construction for business advantage. He was systematically proving that Richard's resistance to innovation had been strategically misguided. "And my role in this strategy? You represent the kind of design talent that Richard dismissed as commercially irrelevant. Your success with Blueprint Interiors proves that innovative design thinking delivers measurable business value, contrary to everything Richard has claimed about creative approaches being impractical." Understanding the full context of my partnership with Michael was both empowering and sobering. I wasn't just advancing my own career goals, I was participating in a comprehensive demonstration that Richard Harrison's business philosophy was becoming obsolete. "Are you comfortable with that level of competitive engagement?" Michael asked, studying my expression carefully. I thought about everything that had led me to this point. Years of dismissive comments about my work, watching Jake transform into a replica of his father's opinions, family dinners where my professional achievements were minimized or ignored. Richard Harrison had spent 3 years treating me as irrelevant to serious business discussions. "Yes," I said firmly, "I'm comfortable with it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of project planning, client presentations, and preparation for the Las Vegas summit. Blueprint Interiors' success had exceeded every goal I'd set when starting the company, and my partnership with Meridian had established us as one of Atlanta's premier commercial design firms. But the approaching confrontation with Richard cast a shadow over my professional achievements. I knew that revealing our partnership would permanently damage my relationship with Jake's family and potentially my marriage itself. Jake had become so aligned with his father's worldview that he would likely view my collaboration with Michael as a personal betrayal rather than a legitimate business decision. "Are you ready for this?" Lisa asked as we finalized presentation materials for the summit. "Because once you give this presentation, there's no going back to the way things were." "The way things were wasn't working," I replied, reviewing our airport project portfolio one final time. "Richard Harrison has spent 3 years telling me that my work isn't suitable for major commercial projects. Next week, I'm going to prove him wrong in front of the entire industry." The prospect of professional vindication was exhilarating, but it was also tinged with sadness about the personal relationships that would be casualties of my business success. I was about to achieve everything I'd worked toward professionally, but the cost would be higher than I'd anticipated when I first accepted Michael's partnership offer. As I boarded the plane to Las Vegas, I carried with me not just presentation materials and portfolio samples, but also the knowledge that I was flying toward a confrontation that would reshape my entire life. The game I'd been playing with Michael was about to reach its conclusion, and I was finally ready to reveal my hand. The champagne glass trembled in my hand as Richard Harrison's booming voice echoed across the packed ballroom of the Bellagio Las Vegas. 200 of the construction industry's most powerful players had gathered for the annual Commercial Development Summit, and my father-in-law stood at the podium like a king addressing his subjects. "Some people think they can waltz into our industry with fancy degrees and pretty sketches," Richard declared, his steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd before landing directly on me. "But real construction isn't about playing with colors and furniture arrangements. It's about steel, concrete, and the backbone to build something that lasts." The pointed insult hit its mark. Every person in that ballroom, knew he was talking about me. Emma Collins, the interior designer who had somehow married into the Harrison construction dynasty. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up my neck as conversations around me hushed to uncomfortable whispers. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in less than 10 minutes I would stand up and deliver the most satisfying revelation of my life. Because the man who had spent 3 years calling my work decorative nonsense had no idea that I was the silent partner behind Meridian Development, the company that had just secured the 3 largest commercial contracts in Atlanta, effectively crushing Harrison Construction's expansion plans. The Bellagio's conference center buzzed with controlled energy as attendees gathered for the industry's most prestigious annual summit. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the famous fountains, reviewing my presentation notes while observing the familiar dance of professional hierarchy. Michael appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a confident expression that suggested he was genuinely looking forward to the day's proceedings. "Ready to change the industry?" he asked, offering me one of the cups. "Ready to prove some people wrong," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The morning sessions began with Richard's panel on traditional construction methodologies. As I settled into a seat near the back of the auditorium, I watched him deliver a polished presentation, emphasizing reliability and proven results, while dismissing innovative approaches as experimental nonsense. The commercial development industry has seen numerous trends come and go over the past 3 decades, Richard began confidently. Sustainable building, smart technology integration, flexible workspace design. These concepts generate excitement during planning phases, but they consistently create cost overruns and maintenance challenges during implementation. His presentation was skillfully delivered and well received by audience members representing established firms with similar philosophies. But listening to Richard's arguments while knowing the details of his recent contract losses, I could hear the defensive undertones suggesting he was responding to competitive pressures rather than speaking from unquestioned market leadership. "Client expectations haven't fundamentally changed," Richard concluded. "They still want reliable contractors who can deliver functional buildings on schedule and within budget. Companies that remember these basics will continue to succeed, while firms that chase trends will discover that novelty can't substitute for competence." The audience applauded appreciatively, but the questions that followed revealed undercurrents of concern about changing market dynamics that Richard's presentation hadn't fully addressed. "Mr. Harrison," asked a woman from a Dallas development firm, "how do you respond to clients who specifically request design integration and flexible building systems?" Richard's expression tightened slightly. "I suggest that experienced developers help educate clients about the practical implications of various approaches rather than simply implementing whatever concepts are currently fashionable." As the panel concluded, I felt anticipation and anxiety about my upcoming presentation. Richard had just spent 30 minutes arguing that innovative design integration was commercially impractical, and I was about to present comprehensive evidence contradicting every point he'd made. During the brief intermission, Jake appeared behind me with surprise evident on his face. "Emma, I didn't expect to see you here." My heart rate spiked as I realized my carefully planned timeline for disclosure had just been accelerated. "Hi, Jake. I didn't know you were planning to attend today's sessions. Dad's panel ran shorter than expected, so I decided to stay. What brings you to Las Vegas?" "Blueprint Interiors has been invited to present at the summit," I said, technically accurate if incomplete. Jake's expression shifted from surprise to pride. "Emma, that's incredible. When is your presentation?" "Actually, it's next, in about 15 minutes. What's your topic?" "Integrated design planning for complex infrastructure projects." "That sounds like exactly the kind of innovative approach Dad was just discussing," Jake said enthusiastically, apparently missing his father's critical perspective on such approaches. "He'll be interested to hear your take." The moderator announced the afternoon session would begin momentarily. As attendees settled in for what had been advertised as a showcase presentation on breakthrough development approaches, I spotted Richard near the front, apparently intending to stay despite having completed his own panel. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our afternoon keynote presentation featuring Emma Collins from Blueprint Interiors and Michael Chen from Meridian Development. They'll be presenting their innovative collaboration on the Atlanta Airport District Development, a project that has redefined industry standards for integrated design and construction management." The introduction sent a visible ripple through the audience, as attendees recognized the significance of the project and speakers. I felt rather than saw Richard's reaction to hearing Michael's name announced, but Jake's shocked expression was clearly visible. Michael took the stage first, delivering a comprehensive overview of Meridian Development's approach to the airport district project and the challenges that had made traditional construction methods inadequate for the technical requirements. The airport district development required unprecedented coordination between construction management, design integration, and operational logistics, Michael explained. Traditional approaches that treat these elements as separate phases were simply inadequate for delivering the functionality our client required. As Michael detailed Meridian's methodology, I could see audience members taking notes and nodding in recognition of the challenges he described. His presentation made a compelling case that innovative approaches weren't just creative preferences, but practical necessities for complex projects. The key breakthrough came from recognizing that interior design planning needed to be integrated into structural and systems decisions from the earliest phases. Michael continued, setting up my portion. This required finding a design partner who could think strategically about space planning rather than simply decorating completed construction. I walked toward the podium, intensely aware of Jake's shocked expression and Richard's dawning recognition of what he was witnessing. "Thank you, Michael," I said, accepting the microphone with steadier hands than I'd expected. Blueprint Interior's role in the airport district project represents a fundamental shift in how commercial design can enhance building functionality and client operations. The next 20 minutes represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward professionally. I presented detailed case studies showing how integrated design planning had solved practical problems that traditional approaches couldn't address, delivered measurable improvements in space utilization and operational efficiency, and provided long-term adaptability that would serve the client's evolving needs. The results speak for themselves, I concluded, displaying final performance metrics showing superior outcomes across every measure the client had prioritized. Integrated design planning isn't just aesthetically superior, it's functionally superior, economically superior, and strategically superior for clients who want buildings that enhance their operations rather than simply housing them. The audience response was immediate and enthusiastic. Applause filled the auditorium as attendees recognized they'd witnessed a presentation that challenged fundamental assumptions while providing concrete evidence of better approaches. But my attention focused on two specific audience members, whose reactions would determine the personal consequences of my professional triumph. Jake sat in stunned silence, clearly processing the implications of everything he'd witnessed. Richard's expression was harder to read, but his rigid posture suggested he was rapidly analyzing the competitive and personal implications of what he'd discovered. The question-and-answer session provided additional opportunities to elaborate on our methodology. Several major development firms expressed immediate interest in exploring similar partnerships, and I found myself collecting business cards and scheduling follow-up conversations. As attendees began filing out, Jake approached the stage first, his expression mixing pride, confusion, and concern. "Emma, that was an incredible presentation," he said with genuine admiration. "I had no idea Blueprint Interiors was working on projects of this scope." "Thank you. There are some things about my business that we haven't discussed in detail, like your partnership with Meridian Development." Jake's tone suggested he was beginning to understand that significant information had been withheld. Before I could respond, Richard appeared beside us, his expression carefully controlled but with underlying tension, suggesting he was managing significant anger. "Emma," Richard said with forced politeness, "congratulations on an impressive presentation. I wasn't aware that you'd expanded Blueprint Interiors into such sophisticated commercial work." "Thank you, Richard. It's been an exciting period of growth." "Indeed. And your partnership with Mr. Chen's company represents quite an interesting business development." "Michael has been an excellent collaborator." "I'm sure he has," Richard replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Michael always was talented at identifying opportunities that others might overlook." Jake glanced between his father and me with growing awareness that undercurrents he didn't understand were shaping the conversation. "Dad, do you know Michael Chen?" "Mr. Chen used to work for Harrison Construction," Richard replied, his gaze never leaving my face, "until he decided to pursue other opportunities approximately 2 years ago." Jake's expression indicated he was beginning to grasp the complexity of the relationships involved. "Emma," Jake said slowly, "how long have you been working with Meridian Development?" Several months. Since shortly after we began discussing Blueprint Interior's expansion into larger commercial projects. Several months, Richard repeated, calculating how long I'd been keeping this information from family discussions. And during this time, Meridian has been competing for projects that Harrison Construction was also pursuing? Yes. Including the Airport District project that Harrison Construction submitted a proposal for? Yes. Jake's shocked expression indicated he was finally understanding the full scope of what had been hidden from him. Emma, Jake said quietly, why didn't you tell me about this partnership? The hurt in his voice was unmistakable. Because you wouldn't have supported it. You've spent the past year telling me that experimental design concepts don't work in real-world applications. You could have trusted me to understand your professional judgment. Could I? When was the last time you supported my business decisions when they conflicted with your father's opinions? Jake's silence confirmed what we both knew about how completely his thinking had aligned with Richard's perspective. Richard observed this exchange with calculating analysis. When he spoke again, his tone was deceptively casual. Emma, I'm curious about the scope of information sharing between Blueprint Interiors and Meridian Development. Do your collaborative processes include discussion of other firms' capabilities and competitive positioning? I recognize the legal and ethical implications of how I answered. Our collaboration focuses entirely on delivering superior results for shared clients. We don't discuss confidential information about other firms. Of course not. Richard agreed with a smile, suggesting disbelief. Though Michael's familiarity with Harrison Construction's approaches might naturally inform his understanding of market opportunities, Michael's insights come from his own experience and market analysis, not from proprietary information. Richard nodded as if accepting my explanation, but his expression indicated continued suspicion about information flow between Michael and me. Michael approached as the auditorium continued emptying around us. He greeted Jake politely and acknowledged Richard with professional courtesy that barely concealed their mutual antagonism. Richard, good to see you again, Michael said with a slight smile. I thought your panel presentation was an excellent defense of traditional construction methodologies. Thank you, Michael. Your collaboration with Emma has certainly produced impressive results. Emma's design expertise has been instrumental in Meridian's success. We've been fortunate to work with such a talented partner. I'm sure you have, Richard said with multiple layers of meaning. Jake had remained silent during this exchange, apparently processing the complex dynamics between his father, his wife, and a business competitor he'd never heard of until today. Emma, I think we need to discuss this situation privately, Jake said, his careful tone suggesting he was struggling to manage his emotional reaction. Of course. Why don't we all plan to continue this conversation when we're back in Atlanta? Richard suggested with forced reasonableness. There are obviously some family business matters that require discussion. The phrase family business matters was clearly intended to remind everyone that my marriage created connections between my professional activities and Harrison family interests. Jake and I rode the elevator to our hotel floor in silence. When we reached our room, Jake moved immediately to the window while I settled into the chair where I'd spent the morning reviewing presentation materials. Emma, Jake said without turning from the window, I feel like I don't know who you are anymore. I'm the same person I've always been. I've just stopped accepting limitations that other people tried to place on my career. What limitations? Jake turned to face me with genuine bewilderment, apparently not understanding what constraints I was referring to. Jake, when was the last time your father took my business seriously during family conversations? He's always been supportive of your entrepreneurial efforts. Supportive of my efforts, or respectful of my capabilities? Jake frowned, apparently searching his memory for examples of Richard treating Blueprint Interiors as a legitimate commercial enterprise. He's mentioned your work positively during family dinners. He's mentioned my work condescendingly. There's a difference between acknowledging someone's activities and respecting their professional expertise. Emma, Dad built a multi-million-dollar construction company from nothing. His perspective comes from decades of experience. And my perspective comes from education, training, and hands-on experience, building a successful design firm. Why is his expertise automatically more valuable than mine? Jake was quiet for several minutes, processing questions he hadn't previously considered about family dynamics he'd accepted as normal. I never thought about it. From your perspective, he admitted finally, Jake, 3 years ago, you believed innovative design thinking could revolutionize commercial development. Now you repeat your father's arguments about experimental approaches being impractical. What happened to your own opinions? The question clearly troubled Jake, forcing him to confront how completely his thinking had been shaped by his father's influence. I learned more about market realities. Market realities according to whom? According to Dad, obviously. And what about market realities according to clients who choose innovative firms over traditional ones? Jake sat down, his expression indicating he was struggling with cognitive dissonance between inherited assumptions and contradictory evidence. We talked for another hour, covering years of accumulated tensions that had been masked by our mutual desire to avoid family conflicts. Jake gradually began acknowledging patterns he'd previously considered normal but that I'd experienced as professionally limiting. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally. "I didn't realize how much Dad's influence was affecting my ability to support your goals. And I'm sorry I kept the Meridian partnership secret. But I was afraid that telling you would mean choosing between my marriage and my career. It shouldn't have felt like that choice. I should have been your advocate, rather than another obstacle." The conversation felt like a breakthrough in understanding, but it also highlighted how much our relationship had been damaged by months of growing in different directions. "Jake, where do we go from here?" "I don't know. I need to figure out what I actually believe about business and success, rather than just accepting Dad's opinions as my own. And I need to figure out whether we can rebuild a marriage where we support each other's goals, rather than competing for loyalty between relationships and professional development." We agreed to postpone further discussion until returning to Atlanta, when emotions had settled and we could think more clearly about our relationship's future. But we both recognized that the Las Vegas revelations had fundamentally altered our marriage dynamics in ways that couldn't be undone through better communication alone. The following months brought developments that exceeded my most optimistic projections for Blueprint Interior's growth. The Las Vegas presentation had generated partnership inquiries from development firms across the Southeast, and our airport district project was featured in national industry publications as an example of innovative design integration. Richard's response was to double down on defending traditional construction methods, while privately scrambling to develop competitive responses. Harrison Construction announced a strategic initiative to enhance design capabilities through partnerships with established architectural firms, but their approach remained fundamentally reactive rather than innovative. Jake and I met occasionally for dinner conversations that revealed slow progress in his efforts to develop independent thinking about family and business issues, but those conversations also highlighted how much our relationship had been damaged. "I'm beginning to understand how much Dad's influence affected my ability to think clearly," Jake admitted during one dinner. "But I'm not sure I can change enough to become the kind of partner you deserve." "What kind of partner do you think I deserve?" "Someone who supports your goals automatically, rather than requiring months of internal struggle to choose between family loyalty and marital support." Our conversations continued over several months, with gradual progress complicated by periodic setbacks when family pressures triggered Jake's defensive reflexes about Harrison Construction's competitive position. Meanwhile, Blueprint Interiors continued expanding at a pace that required constant adaptation. We opened offices in Charlotte and Nashville, hired 12 additional staff members, and established ourselves as one of the Southeast's most prominent commercial design firms. 6 months after Las Vegas, Jake and I met for what we both recognized would be a definitive conversation about our marriage's future. "Emma," Jake began, "I've spent months trying to figure out whether I can change enough to become the kind of husband you need." "And what have you concluded?" "That I want to change. But I'm not sure I can change quickly enough or completely enough to repair the damage already done." "What kind of damage?" "Trust, primarily. You felt like you couldn't share important professional decisions because I might prioritize family loyalty over supporting your goals. And you were probably right." Jake's honesty was painful but clarifying, acknowledging patterns that had undermined our marriage long before my partnership with Michael brought them into focus. "I love you, Emma," Jake said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. "But I love you enough to recognize that you deserve a partner who supports your success automatically rather than requiring internal struggle to choose between competing loyalties. I love you too. But I love myself enough to know that I won't sacrifice my professional goals to preserve relationships that require me to stay small." The divorce process was handled as amicably as possible, given the business complications involved. Jake moved to a downtown apartment while I kept our midtown place, and we managed property division without significant conflict. Richard's response to our separation mixed disappointment about family disruption with apparent relief that competitive conflicts had been resolved through personal rather than business adjustments. 2 years after the Las Vegas summit, I stood in Blueprint Interior's expanded headquarters, reviewing architectural plans for our upcoming West Coast office opening. The company had exceeded every goal I'd set during its startup phase, establishing us as a national leader in commercial design innovation. My partnership with Michael had evolved into a comprehensive alliance that was reshaping commercial development practices across multiple markets. We had proven that integrated design planning wasn't just aesthetically superior but functionally and economically superior for clients wanting buildings that enhanced their operations. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that personal growth sometimes requires choosing between competing values in ways that create inevitable losses alongside meaningful gains. Achieving my professional goals had cost me my marriage and damaged family relationships, but it had also provided independence, confidence, and satisfaction that couldn't have been attained by accepting others' limitations on my career. "Emma," Lisa called from across the office, "there's someone here to see you." I looked up to see Jake standing in our reception area, looking uncertain but hopeful. "Hi, Emma. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course. Come to my office." "I wanted to update you on some changes in my life," Jake began after we'd settled into comfortable chairs. "I left Harrison Construction 3 months ago. The announcement surprised me completely." "What happened?" "I finally realized I was never going to develop my own professional identity while working for Dad. Every decision was filtered through his expectations and opinions." "What are you doing now?" "I started a consulting firm that helps traditional construction companies adapt to changing market conditions. Specifically, I help them develop partnerships with design firms and technology companies that can enhance their service offerings." The irony was remarkable. Jake was now professionally advocating for exactly the innovative approaches his father had dismissed as commercially impractical. "How has Richard responded?" "About as well as you'd expect. He views it as betrayal of family loyalty and questions my judgment about business opportunities." "I'm sorry that's been difficult." "Actually, it's been liberating. For the first time since college, I'm thinking independently about business strategy rather than simply absorbing Dad's perspective." Jake's transformation was evident in his confidence and clarity about professional goals, reflecting personal values rather than inherited expectations. "What does this visit mean for us?" "I don't know. I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to tell me about developing independent thinking and supporting each other's goals. But I recognize that understanding something intellectually isn't the same as proving I can apply it consistently. Are you suggesting we consider reconciliation?" "I'm suggesting I'd like the opportunity to demonstrate that I can be the kind of partner you deserve from the beginning. But I understand if too much damage has been done." I studied Jake's expression, looking for signs of the defensive reflexes that had undermined our marriage. Instead, I saw someone who had genuinely wrestled with fundamental questions about identity, loyalty, and personal growth. "What would you do if your consulting work created competitive conflicts with Harrison Construction?" "I'd prioritize my professional obligations and personal integrity over family political considerations. Dad's approval is no longer more important than doing work that reflects my own values." "And what would you do if I made business decisions you disagreed with or didn't understand?" "I'd trust your judgment and support your choices, then ask questions to understand your thinking, rather than assuming you were wrong because your approach differed from conventional wisdom." The responses suggested genuine change rather than temporary adaptations designed to repair our relationship without addressing underlying issues. "I'd like to explore the possibility of rebuilding our relationship," I said finally, "but slowly, and with clear expectations about supporting each other's professional development regardless of external pressures." That's all I can ask for, and more than I probably deserve given how long it took me to understand what our marriage should have been. We agreed to begin with occasional dinners and gradual reconnection, while Jake proved through consistent behavior that his transformation was sustainable. As I prepared for another keynote presentation at the following year's Commercial Development Summit, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that first confrontation with Richard in Las Vegas. Blueprint Interiors had become a national force in commercial design innovation, my partnership with Michael had redefined industry standards, and my relationship with Jake was slowly rebuilding on foundations of mutual respect and independent thinking. This time, I wasn't nervous about family reactions or concerned about competitive implications. I was simply excited to share insights that could enhance how commercial buildings served the people who used them. Walking onto the Bellagio stage, looking out at development professionals who now viewed Blueprint Interiors as an industry benchmark rather than an experimental startup, I thought about the moment 3 years ago when Richard had dismissed my work as commercially irrelevant. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. 3 years ago, I stood in this room and presented our first major project to an industry skeptical about integrated design approaches. Today, those approaches have become industry standards that define successful commercial development. The audience applauded appreciatively, many having implemented variations of the methodologies Blueprint Interiors and Meridian Development had pioneered. But innovation isn't a destination. It's a continuous process of adapting to changing client needs and market conditions. Today, I want to share insights about the next generation of design integration that will define commercial development over the next decade. As I launched into my presentation, supported by data and case studies demonstrating measurable benefits of advanced design integration, I realized I had achieved something more valuable than professional success or industry recognition. I had proved to myself that personal growth was possible, that restrictive assumptions could be challenged successfully, and that pursuing authentic goals was worth the temporary costs and complications that change inevitably created. The woman who had sat on the floor of a converted loft studio, surrounded by rejected proposals and mounting bills, had been replaced by someone who understood that limitations imposed by others were only as powerful as the willingness to accept them. And I was no longer willing to accept anyone else's limitations on what I could achieve, whom I could partner with, or how successful I was allowed to become. The game had changed completely, and I had learned to play it on my own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.